Welcome to the voices of transparency and excellence. We're not pivoting, the world is spinning like a top. Let's stop, figure things out, get some answers. Come with us on this ride. Warm regards, Rick and Judi.
Welcome to our podcast series where we address crucial topics impacting our campus and community. I'm Rick Gatteau. My co-host Judi Clarke is out on assignment. In today's episode, we'll talk about AI and us. This is a continuation of our conversation we've had last season on the same topic. We're joined today by Nicholas Johnson, Director of AI at Stony Brook University Libraries, and Matthew Salzano, Assistant Professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. Welcome, gentlemen. So happy to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Great. One question for each of you. Define AI.
I come from a technical background, so I'm going to talk about statistical learning and large data sets. That, to me, is the definition. So models that are able to detect patterns in large sources of data and actually do predictions based on those patterns.
Yeah, I guess my more communicative answer is it is a machine that can imitate a task that a human would do. I think that's a sort of general definition of what people end up calling AI, starting with really simple things all the way up to now our more advanced applications.
So, Nick, why don't you start by sharing a bit about your role, because it's a newly minted position here at Stony Brook. Tell us about how it came about and just a bit about your background and what brought you to Stony Brook.
Sounds good. It is a new role, and I think it's very exciting. I think the library is trying to take a role in AI and trying to be a thought leader in AI. And so they've sort of established this position. And I think broadly this position is really geared to leverage AI tools and technologies both within the library, but also support the university writ large in terms of AI literacy and engaging in research across the university.
I know you recently did an interview with Inside Higher Ed. Tell us a little about that experience and some of the kind of nuggets of wisdom you shared through that opportunity.
Sure. It was right as I had started this position, so I think I was still getting to know the language a bit more. But, I think one of the things that we really want to do here at the library is to be human-centered in terms of how we're using AI. We really want to think ethically and responsibly about how we use AI. And so I think that's really something where the sort of skill sets that I have developed over the years and my previous roles are really bringing that sort of perspective to my job here currently.
That's great. And we're joined also by Matthew. So Matthew, tell us a little about how you started at Stony Brook. I know the IDEA program helped bring you here to Stony Brook, and tell us about that experience and your role at the university.
Yeah, so I started at Stony Brook in 2023 as an Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Fellow, and Ethical AI, Information Systems, and Data Science and Literacy applied to complex structures and networks.
That's a mouthful.
There will be a quiz later. Fill in the blank. You've got to get them all right. So what that meant was I came to do my job talk, the on-campus interview for this position. I think it was like 3 weeks after ChatGPT became publicly available. And I had applied to this position thinking like, well, I've done a little bit of research about algorithms and like things that some people consider to be machine learning and AI and others not so much. And of course, the sort of definition of AI really changed overnight in public consciousness when ChatGPT came out, because suddenly you could have these seemingly intelligent conversations with a robot. And so I came to give this job talk and was like, well, I guess I am going to have to say some things about ChatGPT now. And that's what the last 2 years have been thinking about how the things I'm an expert in, the sort of broad rhetorical histories of technology and social media and digital media, how they connect to this moment, how they connect to artificial intelligence, and especially how those things connect to things like social change, which is what I'm really interested in and why I think I was suited to that IDEA fellowship. Which was thinking about like how do technologies make it possible for us to advocate for the things the IDEA fellowships stand for, and how do they constrain us in trying to get to those things. So I did that for my first 2 years at Stony Brook, and now I'm assistant professor in the Department of Communication here.
We always think about disruptors in higher ed, and I think technology has often been, in many ways, can be a good disruptor, but create challenges as well. But so Nick, can you go back to share a bit about what are some of the specific functions that you play in this new position in the library, and how do you interface? Is it mostly with faculty, with students, and what are some of the projects you're working on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think libraries are in particularly being disrupted by this technology, right? Libraries have typically been so slow evolving movers in terms of technology adoption. And certainly this is one where libraries are being thrust into the center of this discussion. Broadly, I sort of play two roles. One is working with library staff and faculty in terms of actually implementing AI technologies within the library. So some of that is we have collections of thousands of documents. We want to make them more accessible to our patrons. How do we go about doing that using AI? And so we're sort of building AI systems to explore those technologies. And likewise, how do we make our catalogs more discoverable? Right? So typically you go to the library website, put in a Boolean search string to find what you're looking for. We can now use AI to search those tools semantically, which is a much more meaningful way of searching. So that's on one hand of working internally, both with students, faculty, and staff at the library, but then also engaging with faculty and staff across the university to do research and to say, how do we use AI in different disciplines beyond just computer science to actually do research?
So no more card catalog? Is that still around?
It's
is
improving.
Wait, okay. That's where it's a newer level of the card catalog. Matthew, tell me a bit about within the classroom setting, because I know there's been a lot of I think, fear among people about, is that going to replace what I do as my lecture as a faculty member? Or how can I develop assignments that are actually going to, I want to integrate AI or not, and what does that look like in terms of student learning? So there's a lot of complications that I think is making it a spin on our heads about thinking about how does the curriculum evolve even as a result. So tell us more about some of the work you do in that area.
Yeah, wow. I mean, do you have an hour?
So we've got close to that.
We're close. I'm just going to talk the rest of the time. No, I mean, I think the number one thing for me when it comes to classrooms is that educators need to make really intentional decisions about how AI is going to be used in their classroom. And I think the thing we're all starting to, as educators, come to appreciate is that you either make intentional choices about AI or you make unintentional ones, because students are going to be using it. It's, in fact, almost impossible now to escape using it. Every Google search you do is giving you an AI overview. So it is important. I think it's sort of the responsibility of educators to figure out, how do I want students to use it? I've mostly taken the approach of, I want students to feel comfortable disclosing that they've used it and explain how they think it's influenced their learning and their process of creating something, and to reflect with them on what might be the best ways of using AI. The research from, say, Anthropic, the company that makes Claude, is a little scary to me, because it shows that they surveyed a bunch of student chats with their chatbot Claude, and then ranked sort of where on Bloom's taxonomy, which is the sort of scale of learning. The lowest order is recall, and the highest order skill is creating. And they said, okay, so where are they using Claude for? Where in the order here of Bloom's taxonomy are they using it? And it's primarily up at the top. It's the creating and analyzing and synthesizing, which to me is the most exciting part of learning. That's what I don't want you to be exporting and offloading to your AI chatbot. I want you to do that part. Use it to help you understand things or recall things, quiz you on topics, or help you understand a complex reading. And then when it's time to actually create a thesis or something, do that on your own. That's the fun part. So I'm making those sorts of decisions in the classroom, but you could also, I think it's very important to highlight, go the opposite direction. Use Blue Book exams, go back to the bubble tests, take the tech out of the classroom. I think there's a real benefit to what some scholars like Katie Day-Good are calling media quiteracy, which is that media literacy includes education about how to opt out and quit and not use it, and actually take a break from our society that's overwhelmed with digital technology all the time. And in the classroom, just be focused on the sort of human interaction. I think we need a both-and approach, basically.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, because we're in a system now, in order for someone to demonstrate that they're the author of their own work. I'm thinking back to my days in school of the Blue Book, as you mentioned. I'm thinking about, and I actually had this conversation a couple of years ago. I was at a conference, and I was sitting next to a gentleman. We got on the subject. AI was just newly in discussion. And the example I shared was around, writing classes. So think about your role in communication and journalism, and that obviously there's a skill in the art of writing, of synthesizing information, about creating a quality work that's your own. And now you've got the AI piece intersecting with that. And the example that this gentleman I mentioned, I'm scared that we're going to lose this art of writing, because students, they learn to write. And if AI is too engaged, you never really learn the semantics of quality writing. And his response to me was, well, Rick, in math, they introduced the calculator. Was his equivalent around that actually still allowed math to continue, but it had to adapt in a different way. So I thought it was an interesting way to look at it. And I'm wondering, in the work that you do working with students, where do you see writing still being up? Will we have writing classes 5 years from now? What does the future look like in terms of how students will learn to write and be writers?
Yeah. Well, let's find this guy and get him on the pod because I've got some things to say. Listen, I think the calculator analogy, I'd be curious to hear what Nick has to say about this too. I think there's all sorts of ways that that's kind of faulty. But even in this example, you can see a problem, which is that when you're a second grader learning addition, or you're in third grade learning your multiplication and division tables, you're not allowed to pull out the calculator yet. That calculator is in your backpack until it's allowed later in the semester or further on in the process. And so the reality will be the same, I think, with AI writing, which is that you can't do it right away. You don't know what a good essay looks like. You don't know what a good argument looks like. You have to actually develop those skills independently of the shortcut. And then, yes, there will be more use of it akin to maybe a calculator, where once I've learned my writing version of multiplication tables, whether that's, I don't know, recognizing the 5-paragraph essay or genre conventions or what have you, then I can pull up the ChatGPT and have it help me with my paper. So, I think that's my go-to response now to the sort of calculator thing, is that, sure, it's fair. There's some comparison there, but I think writing like that will always be key and should be key in our sort of pedagogical process. Writing is thinking, is what writing scholars say all the time, right? There was this big move in writing studies, I want to say 30 or 40 years ago now, to think about process pedagogy, that the most important part of writing was the sort of process of thinking slowly and deliberately arguing and reviewing evidence, and that the sort of output of a final paper was less important than the continual process of writing. And I think if we lose that, we lose a really important part of education, not just in freshman composition, but across the whole university, where writing is meant to help stimulate thinking.
Right. So do you want to respond to that? And I do want to ask a follow-up, Ben, is how do we not get to that place? So take it, Nick.
I totally agree with Matthew. I think it's a great point. And I think AI literacy, I think is exactly that, right? Understanding when we should be using it, when we shouldn't be using it. I saw my daughter the other day. She's in 4th grade. She was doing her homework assignment and typed the question into Google to find the answer. She got AI overview and copy and pasted that into her response. She just didn't know that she wasn't supposed to do that, right? And so that's something where we really have to have the AI literacy to make sure that we're understanding when it's appropriate to use AI and when it's not appropriate to use AI. And then regarding AI as a tool or as a calculator, if you will, one of the things I've sort of been evolving my thinking on this a little bit, because I feel that the tool is also shaping us as a society as well, which is a bit different than a calculator. Maybe to some degree it's the same, but we become very attached to this tool in some cases. There's been a lot of reports about people really building relationships with these bots, these LLMs. And so how does that actually affect us as a society? I think it's really important to start to ask those kinds of questions and really think critically about it.
So Nick, tell me what LLM stands for.
Yeah, LLM is a large language model. This is really the technology that's fueling ChatGPT and Gemini, these other tools. It's a way of actually interacting with an AI.
So we know with AI, there's lots out there with parents being scared of the potential of AI and its impact on their children. Can you share a little about insights on that?
I'm looking to the parent in the room. I'm like, I don't know.
Well, as a parent, I'm very concerned about AI. I think there are great opportunities to use AI for learning, but I think there is some concern. I think a part of that concern is when AI is actually replacing our critical thinking skills and actually having youth grow up from a young age, experiencing that through adulthood of this outsourcing their critical thinking skills to AI. I think that is something that is concerning on my behalf.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been incredibly concerning about social media that's just being amplified by generative AI chatbots is this idea that children, young people, humans in general, are primarily having relationships through text. I think having embodied physical interactions with one another is deeply important for development as a child, and then continues to be important as an adult for feeling a sense of community and sustaining a diverse democratic society. And I think to the extent that we're incidentally training children that they don't need to have that experience, that they can just talk on the machine, that's incredibly frightening. Yeah, that seems to be the important distinction between the calculator and ChatGPT, right? Is you don't create a parasocial relationship with your calculator. You can type inappropriate words on it as a 6th grader or whatever, but you can't have a relationship with that. And people are forming what is effectively relationships with ChatGPT, and I think that's really different than the calculator. Anyway, to your question, Rick, about what do we do to prevent this? I mean, I think it's incumbent on institutions of higher education to train educators how to instill critical AI literacy, but also to provide the resources to make sure instructors know how to do the sort of AI-proofed assignments or assignments that use AI in a critical way. I'm thinking about the fact that, like, here at Stony Brook, I still have to go figure out where I buy blue books from. Like, it's not immediately obvious to me where I go get my blue books to give my students a blue book exam. And I think if we want to be serious about, like, no, we need to provide ways to make sure students can be assessed without AI use, that we have to, like, provide all the options of sort of, like, here's how we actually do it. So I think a lot of it comes down to resources like that and workshops and education, trainings, if you will, to help educators realize that. I think that's a big part of it. I think also we have to, collectively continue to demand that this is important to us. I think faculty have to, like, not give in to some of the hype of, like, let's just replace writing. Like, we're not going to need it anymore. Not give in to sort of the inevitability discourse that, like, this is all going to be worthless, so let's just give up.
Have you both had a sense that when faculty are looking at their course syllabi now with the lens of AI on it, that they're making substantive changes to their syllabi as a result, or still are we in a transition period as that evolves?
I think most of what I understand is more anecdotal. I haven't worked with faculty as much in terms, but I do think that there is a spectrum of people who are engaging with this and saying, let's let students do what they want to do with AI in the classroom. And then the other spectrum is absolutely not, we won't do this. And I think that can also be somewhat problematic. And there has to be this nice middle ground. And Matthew, I think to your point, having some transparency about what's expected in the classroom is going to be really critical to ensure that students are properly using AI in the ways that we're expecting them to.
Yeah, what a good question about, like, where we're at. I was talking to a teaching and learning professional at a different university last week, and she was saying she thinks that we've sort of done, like, 20% of people have gone through the sort of adoption curve and are now in the spot of being competent to revise their syllabi and really do something to either incorporate AI or change their assessments so that they're more, AI proofed, if you will. And she was sort of like, now we're in the next 10%, and this is going to be how this goes. Like, it's just going to be slow processes of people sort of entering this cycle where initially they're pushing back and then eventually they're going to, include it in ways that work for them. Right. So that's where I sort of think we're at. Like, I think, a solid quarter or maybe even a third of faculty at this point are doing things pretty proactively. And we're sort of seeing another third now realizing they need to figure it out. And then that final third is sort of like still ignoring it, or
We'll have to drag people along.
Right, exactly. Yeah, digging in their heels or something. Yeah.
So, Nick, let me go back to something you shared earlier. When you engage with faculty, they come to the library, and particularly in their area of research, for example, as you were speaking, it made me think about how, in your role in the library more broadly, can really assist faculty in their research endeavors to find the information faster, quicker, just to move their research agenda along in a faster and more focused way. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, a great point. I think one of the things we want to do at the library is to really be able to support faculty across the university, and in particular, faculty who don't necessarily come from a STEM background where they have access to large resources to actually use AI in different ways. So a part of that is providing some technical expertise on how we would do this, how we would think about implementing things. And then the other part is actually providing some resources. The library is developing an in-house AI server where we can actually provide large language models available so people can actually use it here locally rather than offsetting it to ChatGPT or something else. And so, for example, I was approached by a faculty member who was working with a PhD student who she's a violinist, and she recently found some unpublished or unfinished works from a composer who died in the 1940s. She wanted to try and use AI to explore how this could evolve and how you could actually do that. But she didn't really have the technical background and understanding to do that. So we're working with her to provide the resources to think through what does that project actually look like, and then to sort of push the research forward in terms of completing this work and what does it actually mean to have an AI generate finish a complete work from a composer.
That's interesting. For both of you, can you also talk about the evolution and development or need for AI policies at a higher ed institution? Because I know that's been fraught with some conversation. What does a policy look like? Maybe because it's so fresh and new, it's hard to come up with that. So where should we be going in terms of actual, in air quotes, policies around AI?
I think we're going to a meeting together today about this.
Oh, good. Perfect time.
Yeah, coincidentally. I personally strongly believe that institutions should have policies. That there should be some sort of statement about how the university's values should reflect in student and faculty and staff AI use. Because I think otherwise people don't have any guidance to make those decisions. And will just do whatever seems best to them, and they may not have the sort of background needed to make those decisions in an informed way. So I think the problem with those policies is that they have to be flexible enough to accommodate, for example, people who want to be inventive with AI use. Sometimes these policies are really restrictive because they're like trying to protect privacy, for example. Like, don't use any student work in AI. Okay, well, what if I'm teaching a class where the whole point is students are creating things that we're then going to train a model together with? Like, I'm violating the policy, but I'm not really violating my students' ability to consent to having their work used in AI models, since we're doing something with it for educational purposes. So the sort of flexibility needed in these policies makes them really challenging to lay out. But I think those policies, if they can be rooted in values, right? Stony Brook's a public institution of the state of New York. SUNY serves, what is it, like 1 in 4 students in New York or something mind-boggling like that. And I think we have to keep those sorts of things in mind as we come up with our policy and think about how do we use this in a way that reflects our commitment to the sort of public good of the people of New York, for example, to serving our communities near us, and what AI use would sort of prevent us from having that type of connection, relationship, and living out those values.
And Nick, what's your take on AI policy?
I think Matthew was spot on here. I think the one thing I would add is just understanding that the policy is going to have to adapt over time. I think we're still in a phase where there's a lot of change, there's a lot of new technologies coming out very quickly, and to have some very restrictive overarching policy that won't actually allow us to explore and be creative with these tools and technologies would be a hindrance. So I think, how do we think about an evolving policy over time, staying on top of it? But I think the way to do that, as Matthew was saying, is to really focus on our principles and our values and try and articulate those through a policy.
In expanding on this a little bit more, obviously ethical considerations, bias, surveillance, other privacy. You just mentioned, Matthew. What can you unpack that a little bit in terms of whether that is part of a policy or just some issues that need to be considered as AI develops and evolves?
That's a good question.
I see this really as establishing a core competency in terms of AI literacy, understanding the foundational, how LLMs work, how AI models work. That's critical. Understanding how to use the tools and technologies, that's critical. Understanding all the components of ethical and responsible uses is critical. Now, whether that actually gets folded into a policy specifically, that's a little more difficult to say. But I think really, if we're able to provide that kind of education, those kinds of workshops and tutorials on what that is and how to actually experience some of that, I think that really lays a solid foundation for us to then build on top of policies from there.
Tell me, in your roles, as you've interacted with people around the topic of AI, what has surprised you the most about say it's Stony Brook in terms of people's reaction to AI?
I often say that I think it's fun being in the position I'm in. I'm a sort of humanities trained rhetoric researcher, but in communication studies. So I'm often hanging out with sort of social scientists. And then because of this fellowship that I started with at Stony Brook, I'm also connected to the sort of like most intensive computer scientists and engineers. And I find that like depending on what meeting I'm in, I'm either the like most Luddite critical person or I'm the like most hyped up AI person. And it really, like, at a given day, I can be either position, which I find highly amusing. I think that's been pretty surprising to me, is just the, when you're in graduate school, you kind of only hang out with your tiny little niche of people. And so to really get a sense here at Stony Brook of the huge range of perspectives about AI use and how we should be using AI and whether we should be using AI, that's been not just surprising, but like kind of refreshing to me. It's enjoyable to see the whole diversity of opinion there.
Well, I'm wondering too, then, Nick, with your work, obviously cross-discipline, and faculty mentioned about STEM versus, other areas of focus. What have you seen in terms of the faculty you've interacted with related to their, embracing of AI? And is it ever fall on discipline lines, or are there other factors?
Well, it's been exciting. I think there is an enthusiasm, a level of enthusiasm, which is really refreshing and exciting. And I think there's a level of creativity that's also coming out of this, which I think is also really exciting. That everyone sort of is asking the question, can I have an LLM or an AI do this? What if we tried to do this with AI? And I think that's kind of an exciting part of being, especially where I am, and then also bridging between disciplines. I also come from a data science, computer science background, so working across disciplines is really exciting for me. And so it's been really refreshing and exciting to be in this role.
One of the concerns, and both on, I'd say on the student end, but also faculty end, is concerns around plagiarism. And to feel that, is this my authentic, original work that I'm producing? Where do we go? Because I had sat on the student side of the conduct for academic integrity piece, and I think this just adds a whole nother layer to that. And maybe it's somewhat around expectations that faculty have communicated, but I'm wondering that, and then on the research end of faculty, are there concerns around creating this authentic work that then someone could challenge? Because we've seen in the media about presidents' dissertations being questioned about, this sentence is a direct quote and you didn't cite it correctly. I just think, does this add another layer to that focus?
I think it absolutely does. And I think two sort of points on this. I think being transparent as often as frequent as we can and trying to figure out ways in which we can be transparent in terms of using AI, I think is going to be critical. Can we, in coursework, actually report out on the chats that we were using to generate? Because it's on a spectrum of how we're using LLMs. It's not just I put in a 2-sentence prompt and I got an answer and submitted it. It's an iterative process. We go through this. And I think the more we can design assignments or design projects to actually be transparent how we were using LLMs, I think that'll be really critical. And then the other point, I think, is about establishing norms. And I think if we can really try and promote what is normal usage, I think that can also be really supportive. I can see a future where there are authors who are 100% vetted to be, I have not used AI in my writing. This is a value that I see, and I'm going to hold this value. And I think as a society, we could develop a norm to say that is valuable. And then you could imagine others, which is like, well, I use AI to spell check or to modify this, or I used AI for everything, right? And those are sort of a spectrum of how we could think about it.
Yeah, there's all these businesses now popping up in industry, basically, that can credential your creative work for sort of how much you used AI with it, which is interesting. I mean, I think to the question about plagiarism in the classroom and such, one of the things that's been most frustrating to me about the rise of generative AI use is the way it's fundamentally transforming my relationship with students, which is that I try to pride myself on being the type of teacher that has a high degree of trust in his students and that wants to have that type of sort of mutual relationship that's built on trust and shared interest and curiosity. And I find that the AI use, even though I'm trying to cultivate an environment where you're welcome to use it as long as you disclose how you use it, has made me have to be much more paranoid and suspicious of my students and their work in a way that just simply wasn't something I was doing before. Like maybe you'd recognize a paragraph was pasted from Wikipedia or something, but this is a far deeper distrust. And I find that deeply frustrating as a teacher, because it's just not the type of relationship I want to have with students. And so, I think the example you raised about presidents being accused of plagiarism, it's all about a sort of culture where we're further and further devolving into not trusting each other and into suspicion about one another and into a sort of paranoid style. And I don't think that's a positive development in society, to be totally frank. And I'm interested in how we develop here at, thinking about my locus of control here at the university, how we develop policies that can bring back that trust, bring back that culture where we're not so paranoid with one another. Because I think that's a potentially really damaging effect of all this is the constant assumption something is not real, something is machine generated.
Well, I hope that faculty research doesn't have to now be submitted in a blue book form.
Well, right.
That would be a challenge.
Well, and I think the academic disciplines have not figured this out yet, right? I keep telling people that I had the experience of journal reviewing the other day where in order to submit my review, I had to check a box saying I hadn't used generative AI for the review. But the funny thing about that is you can't submit the review unless you check the box. So you can't say I used it for X, Y, and Z. You have to attest you didn't use it, which means if you used it, you're just checking the box and submitting it. There's no way for you to actually say, here's what I did. So we've just really not caught up in a meaningful way, I would say, to thinking about what are the norms for academic research on how you use generative AI.
Final question for each of you. As you look to the future, and let's look maybe 5 to 10 years from now, where's AI going over that next decade?
I think AI is going the way of Wikipedia, which is to say that, when I was in high school, let's say, and Wikipedia is every educator's like deep fear is like, you can't just use Wikipedia. It's not a reliable source. You need to, go consult an actual encyclopedia or what have you. And I think now the way we use Wikipedia is like, yeah, I don't want you to cite Wikipedia directly, but it actually has a lot of good information. So if you want to start there and go find other sources, that's great. I think, this is my hope, my optimistic take, is that in 5 to 10 years, at least in the educational context, we'll see that AI works like Wikipedia, where we say, well, you can't just like paste in whatever you get out of that or what have you, but there are ways to use it responsibly. That's my hope, is that it becomes much like social media as well, where, it will have destructive effects, but also maybe not as destructive as the worst critics imagined. That's where I hope we're headed in a way.
Yeah, I think when I think of my own AI usage, for me, I'm actually replacing Googling as a process, right? I'm actually using LLMs more in terms of just not Googling things anymore and looking for that. There are specific things I'll still go to Google and look through, but by and large, that's how I'm using it. And I think that's also sort of a trend in AI it's starting to replace the web browser. It's starting to use that first point of contact. And I think there are positives and negatives to that. And I think we really have to think critically about how we'll move forward with it.
Well, I just wanted to thank you both, Nick and Matthew, for sharing your insights and expertise today. It was just really a great conversation. We hope our listeners continue to find these discussions informative and empowering. So join us again for next week's episode, where we'll talk about an upcoming book by Stony Brook University professor Musa Al-Garbi titled Those People, which is about polarization. For now, I'm Rick Gatteau, and thank you for tuning in.